Okay, we're live. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Data Dialogues hosted by Analytics 8. This is a monthly series that we do on LinkedIn Live, where we discuss a relevant topic or trend in the data analytics industry. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Lobo. I'm a managing director here at Analytics 8, and I lead our analytics service line. With me today, I have David Walborn. David is a principal in our tech and strategy team. He's an all-around expert on all things Microsoft, which is really good because today's topic is going to be on Microsoft Fabric. David and I are going to be going through the new licensing model that was rolled out with Fabric, some ideal licensing combinations based upon varying scenarios, and just an overall general overview of Microsoft Fabric. So with that, let's dive into the discussion. David, you ready to bring Fabric to the masses?
Let's do it, Kevin.
All right, so we'll start at the top. What is Microsoft Fabric?
Yeah, so Microsoft Fabric is Microsoft's new cloud SaaS product. It brings together several different services all into one single end-to-end data analytics platform. Many of those services you may be familiar with already that have existed independently, but really it's bringing together Azure Data Factory, Azure Synapse Analytics, and Power BI all into this unified platform. So altogether, it's providing 7 different workloads or components or what are being called experiences in the platform. So to quickly run through each of those 7, one, we have Azure Data Factory. This is a tool for data engineers to build integrations. It has the same 200 plus native connectors that you would be familiar with if you've operated in Azure Data Factory to connect to a variety of data sources. We have the data engineering experience, from Azure Synapse, which is more of a notebook-driven tool for transforming data at scale using Spark. We have the data science experience, which is similar to the Azure Synapse data science experience for building, optimizing, and productionalizing your machine learning models. So a nice tool for experimentation there. We have the data warehouse experience, which is a traditional column store storage engine that gives you a SQL endpoint for connecting to and querying against your data. We have real-time analytics. So these are for more IoT use cases, streaming data services, and you can connect those to, say, an Azure Event Hub. We have Power BI, the same experience that we're already familiar with, data analytics and visualization. And lastly, we have a new feature that will be coming called Data Activator. Data Activator is a no-code platform which can read your data and detect actionable conditions and trigger some actions from that. So you could think about an anomaly coming up in your data. It could send a Teams message. It could shoot out some emails. And it could trigger some Power Automate tasks. So it all fits nicely together. So those are the 7 different components that are all a part of Microsoft Fabric.
So we have 7 components under one unified umbrella today, but I'm kind of curious what's sitting behind it from an overall platform foundation perspective.
Yeah, good question. So the foundation on which all of those services, all of those experiences are built is called OneLake. So you could think of it as OneDrive, but for your data and analytics assets there. So OneLake is, a SaaS experience, and it's built on top of Azure Data Lake Storage or ADLS Gen 2, another familiar component for Azure users. And what it does is it provides a unified location where all of your organizational data can be stored, and all of the experiences that we talked about will operate on top of the assets that are in your OneLake. So the thinking behind this, the idea behind it, is to eliminate data silos that you might see in an organization, right? We have one central place to democratize our data. And with all of these centralized assets, you still have the ability to operate in a decentralized model where each developer, each business unit can create their own workspaces. They can ingest the data and do whatever business rules and ETL logic that they need analyze and visualize that data in Power BI ultimately. So this architectural pattern is one centralized source of data, which is
Mhm.
going to enable several more decentralized or distributed teams.
Okay. I do kind of love that phrasing, OneDrive for data. So let's move on to our next question. So I've worked on a few Microsoft-oriented projects myself. And in those projects, I was touching things like ADF and Synapse and Power BI. And I know that's the case for a lot of customers today. They're already using a lot of the components that are underneath Fabric. So how does Fabric factor into all of that for customers that are using some of those existing Microsoft utilities today?
So the good news for customers who have made big investments into things like ADF or Synapse or Power BI, none of those platforms in isolation go away. Those will be available for years to come. So if you have already made a big investment there, it's no need to fret or think about a total migration plan. It's not necessary to do all of that today.
Okay. So let's just talk through a scenario. What happens if I have an existing Power BI workspace today? How does that factor into Fabric?
Yeah. So if you have an existing Power BI workspace, you can very easily just from the admin portal turn on the features capability for Fabric, no problem. If you do so, there's not a migration involved. As soon as you turn it on, all of those Fabric experiences become available to you, and the content that you already have in your Power BI workspaces, they stay there, right? You have the same capabilities as before. You can build data sets, you can build and publish reports, and even the development process using Power BI Desktop, that's not changing. That experience won't change. So fundamentally, if you're using Power BI today, even if you turn on Fabric, the overall Power BI experience itself won't fundamentally change.
Okay. And if I have a Power BI project in flight, I have a migration in flight, something that's active, ongoing as Fabric is being rolled out, how does that kind of affect anything from a strategic planning perspective?
Yeah, from a strategic standpoint, if you're already actively working on a project like that, or maybe you have some plan for the remainder of the year, the introduction of Fabric does not provide an obligation to change your course and fit into the new Fabric paradigm. But now that it is available to you and these features are in your toolkit now, these different experiences, you might want to consider them as options for the future. So you can experiment with it and see, maybe it makes sense to replace some of the things that you're doing today with some of the capabilities that are in Fabric.
Okay. So that kind of touches upon the Power BI component of it, but what about customers who are using something like ADF or using something like Synapse today?
Yeah, so as of today, if I log on, there's not a super simple or easy way, a one-click method to automatically migrate your ADF pipelines or your Synapse workloads into Fabric. Although that is a very critical part of the roadmap, and Microsoft will make that easier going forward. So if you think about, you have notebook driven Spark jobs or workloads in Synapse, it could be very easy to migrate those code assets into Fabric. But ultimately, you still need to make sure that that underlying data is getting into that one lake, that foundation that sits behind Fabric.
Okay. And really quick for viewers out there who might not be familiar with Synapse, can you just give like a quick 1 or 2 sentence overview on what that is?
Yeah, so Synapse it's an enterprise data platform, formerly known as Azure SQL Data Warehouse. And it's a place for storing your data, analyzing your data, creating pipelines, using ML. And if you think about some of its competitors out there, you might think about Snowflake or Databricks or BigQuery. So those would be some alternate options to Synapse.
Okay. And what's kind of the key differentiator for Synapse within Microsoft Fabric?
Right. So there is a fundamental change from Synapse on its own to Synapse in Fabric. Synapse on its own is a platform as a service, whereas all of Fabric is serving as a SaaS platform. So moving from Synapse to Fabric will fundamentally change that experience a little bit. So Fabric is a successor to ADF and Synapse. Microsoft will be making future investments into the Fabric capabilities more so than Synapse. And it's intended to enhance those experiences that you are already used to on those platforms. But because it is SaaS as opposed to platform as a service, it's taking away the need to manage a lot of those Azure resources and dedicated SQL pools and Spark clusters. You think about all those things, it's going to provide a significantly faster and easier experience to do so. Because all of your compute is going to be pooled across all of your experiences. So your compute for a lakehouse is going to be shared with your compute for your Power BI resources. So ultimately, the intent is to simplify that pricing model and ultimately decrease that total cost of ownership of your end-to-end data analytics platform. But you have a little bit less control over that now. So, but ultimately, when you do bring everything together like that, it's a great way to manage technical debt over time. You can simplify and centralize your code bases. So, that's a really valuable thing. That's really difficult to put a price on.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to throw you a bit of a curveball since you did mention Snowflake and you did mention Databricks. Obviously, Snowflake, Databricks, BigQuery, they've eaten up a ton of market share in the past couple of years, just as it relates to cloud data platforms. Do you see Fabric pushing Synapse to the forefront of those conversations now?
Yeah, and I do. Because Power BI is deeply integrated into the Fabric experience, and because Power BI has such great adoption in the marketplace, I think it's going to encourage users to adopt more of those Fabric experiences. And I think it could, turn the heads of a user who might be using Databricks and Power BI. It may make sense for them to integrate that all into, an all-in-one platform where Fabric is the thing sitting behind Power BI as opposed to something like Databricks or Snowflake.
Okay. So I wanted to shift gears and wanted to move to the topic of licensing. Obviously, it's a big consideration for customers that are evaluating Fabric. Having recently gone through putting together costing estimates on a proposal for Fabric, I can say it's not the easiest to understand out of the gate. So can you give a brief overview on what the licensing structure looks like for Fabric?
Sure, and I totally hear that struggle. It's been confusing to do Power BI licensing alone, and now we're introducing this wrinkle of Fabric. So the two things that are a couple prerequisites that you need to understand to arrive at how Fabric licensing works is understand the existing licensing model. And there are two different types of licensing that are out there today. There's user-based licensing and there's capacity-based licensing. So when you think about user-based licensing, we're talking about having either a free license, a pro license, or a premium per user license. So without going too deep into them, a free license is your entry into the Power BI web service. You get my workspace. You can experiment with limited sharing. A pro license is an entry point to collaborating with teams, and you can share a workspace and collaborate with other pro users. And premium per user is that entry point into more of the premium focused features like enhanced data flows, data marts, using the XMLA endpoint, and several others.
Okay. So clear on the user-based licensing, but I guess the thing that kind of threw me the most with the rollout of Fabric from a licensing perspective was looking at the capacity-based licensing. So again, just kind of going through my own experience, when we're talking through licensing on a capacity-based model, it's already confusing enough going through the scenarios, talking with the customer about when you should use an A SKU versus a P SKU. And now we're introducing the concept of F SKUs. It kind of makes it a little bit more complicated in having those conversations. So can you give a little bit of detail on the capacity-based licensing model?
Yeah, exactly. So a capacity-based license, as opposed to a user-based license, is This is a provision of some dedicated resources for you.
Mhm.
So you think about compute, you think about memory. It's all of these resources to host the content on your workspaces. You mentioned the different kinds out there, an embedded or an A SKU, a
Right.
premium or a P SKU, and now we have fabric SKUs. So to briefly go through each of these, an embedded SKU or an A SKU is typically an independent software vendor, and they want to use Power BI to embed in maybe a web application or embed some of those visuals. Those are deployed through the Azure portal as opposed to the Microsoft 365 for the other subscriptions. And if you're on an embedded SKU, it's not going to support Fabric, as I understand, so there's not going to be many changes, though the new Fabric SKUs will have some embedded capability available. When we talk about premium SKUs, we're talking about those large enterprise scale dataset
Mhm.
volumes. Those, a P1, the lowest SKU would start at around 5,000 per month, and it's an annual commitment for that. Benefit of premium is I can have this additional sharing capability. So my developers will have pro licenses, and then I have the ability to share that workspace application with my free users. So important to note that premium SKUs have Fabric features enabled for them. And in the future, they will become Fabric SKUs themselves. So,
Okay.
um, you could think about that transition there. But right now, the F SKUs that are out today have a pay-as-you-go pricing model as opposed to the premium SKUs with a annual commitment monthly cost model. Um, the F SKUs start much smaller. There's a much lower point of entry versus a premium SKU.
Mhm.
I think that the lowest F SKU is, I'm sorry, the lowest premium SKU is 32 times the amount of compute as the lowest F SKU. So you could start an F SKU to start experimenting for maybe $200 to $300 per month. And you also have the ability to scale up and scale down an F SKU as necessary.
Yeah, and I think important point for our viewers right now who are listening when we're talking about Fabric SKUs. Right now, there is no reserved instance pricing for Fabric. It's on a pay-as-you-go model. I think from what I was reading, the reserved instance licensing for Fabric SKUs is likely going to be closer to the end of the year. That'll bring down costs, but of course, you're going to have an annual commit upfront as opposed to just paid as you go. Okay, so we covered the user base, covered the capacity based licensing. What do our viewers need to know when they're evaluating whether or not I should go user based licensing or I should go capacity based licensing?
Yeah, I think one of the misconceptions here is that they live in isolation, right? And that it's a choice between a user based or a capacity based. That's not always true. You can have user based licenses on their own, but you cannot have a capacity based license without having some users who are individually licensed to be developers as well. So it's a little bit of a misconception that it's a choice between one or the other. And depending on which model you choose, that can change your sharing capability or the number of licenses that you need. And with that in mind, there is a call out about the new F SKUs. Not all of them are created equal, so to say. The smaller scale F SKUs, starting from F2 to F32, um, this is going to require more pro licenses to operate in that model. But F64 and above, this is very similar to the P1 or
Mhm.
entry level premium. That's going to enable that increased sharing capability that a premium SKU offers. So, F64 as you scale up is going to be appropriate for larger organizations who want to avoid buying hundreds or even thousands of individual licenses for users.
Okay. Um, so I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit, just kind of move to the topic of Power BI. So obviously, I love Power BI. I've developed in Power BI before. I think it has all the market momentum in the world. It's definitely a clear market leader. Given that Power BI is a huge access point for both developers and end users in the Microsoft ecosystem, what does Fabric specifically bring to those who are evaluating or using Power BI?
Yeah, so Fabric is intended to enhance that experience that you already know and love in Power BI. And one of the features that comes to mind for me is Git integration. It has long been a pain point for myself and other Power BI devs. The inability to use Git because Power BI PBIX files are stored as a compressed binary file. It's really difficult to version control that. So what Fabric workspaces are introducing is the integration with a Git repo like Azure DevOps. And you can link your workspace to an Azure DevOps repo. Your underlying data models, your reports can be stored as JSON files in that repository. So it kind of shifts that development cycle that you think about for a Power BI model and report. And you can start to think about how you can compare changes in diffs, you can merge changes, you can use pull requests to approve those. So it is fundamentally changing a little bit the paradigms of how you develop a Power BI model and how you deploy a model ultimately. So right now, that Git integration is supported for data sets and reports, but surely on the Microsoft roadmap is going to be that Git integration for the other assets that Fabric brings to the table.
Okay. And I think that's a huge point because when you look at Power BI, that's probably one of the biggest weaknesses in it as a tool overall. The collaborative development capabilities were always really notably weak. So to kind of bridge that gap for developers, that's going to be a pretty big leap. So what should organizations or what can they do to kind of get running using Fabric if they're already using Power BI?
Yeah, my advice is to try it. It's a really low barrier to entry to try it. Anyone, even a free license user, has the ability to start a 60-day free trial. You can start to consider those additional features or experiences that come with Fabric and how that might be integrated into your Power BI development workflow. Are there pieces of your data architecture that might make more sense to host in a Fabric capacity as opposed to whatever other services that you're using? Even after that 60-day free trial, if you find that, I would prefer to continue to use my other services, you can still elect to use Power BI exclusively.
Okay. So kind of in that same vein, I got my trial version of Fabric up and running. I watched some of the YouTube videos that are out there, some of the demos of the feature functionality. There is a Fabric subreddit out there for reviewers. I definitely went down a rabbit hole reading that, and I would say that one of my big takeaways in kind of playing around with it, watching the videos, kind of reading some of the online commentaries, that it's pretty buggy. So what do you see as the gaps that kind of currently exist within Fabric? And then I guess forward looking, when do you think it'll be ready for primetime use to be scaled out across an organization?
Yeah, that's a really important point that today Fabric is in public preview, right? So Microsoft is communicating that we're getting ready to release this product to GA. It's not there yet. Microsoft is very receptive to the bugs that are being found out there, and they're very active in the Fabric community and, like you said, in the Fabric subreddit as well. So there are going to be some pain points or growth pains as we wait for that GA release. Any speculation about when it's going to be out in GA? I can't say for sure. The Fabric roadmap, I believe, should be coming out in September. So I would anticipate a GA release in maybe early 2024. But again, that's speculation. That's not necessarily public information that I have access to.
So I guess what do you see as some of the limitations in the platform? Because I think it's super important to talk about kind of some of the potential shortcomings for people evaluating it as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one limitation that I think about, or challenge perhaps, is we have this concept of workspace, dev, test, and prod if we're using a deployment pipeline, for example. And now we're introducing the concept of a lakehouse architecture as well, all in the same platform, right? So a very common is like a medallion architecture. You think about bronze, silver, and gold.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think there's a little bit of uncertainty about the best practices for how to structure a medallion architecture alongside these workspaces. If I have, a bronze, silver, and gold workspace, uh, I currently don't have a way to trigger a job in silver when a job in bronze completes. So that paradigm of having workspaces and a medallion architecture, in my opinion, needs a little bit more clearly established best practices.
Okay. Um, what about the security and governance model? How does that function? How do you kind of see that today?
Yeah, so one component that's coming with Fabric is One Lake security, right? So we talked about One Lake as that underlying foundation of centralized data assets. And there's now this concept of One Lake security. Um, the Power BI security model on its own, the different roles and workspaces and the way that you can share things is already a little bit confusing and it took me a long time to master as someone who's operating in Power BI every day. So um, I do think that there will be some growing pains when it comes to how to establish security for OneLake. Um, I think every organization needs to figure out how the fabric, the OneLake security is going to fit into their data governance program. And right now, some of the limitations are I can't do dynamic row level security like I would in a Power BI data set in the OneLake. So that's a really important consideration for any organization with really sensitive data or PII. And there's some other things I want to learn more about. For example, how am I going to integrate a Azure Key Vault within Fabric for securing credentials? Or, um, you know, ultimately, all of this will be accessible through Microsoft Purview as well. So you think about all of the sensitivity labels that you attach to data sets and reports. All of that is going to be available through Microsoft Purview as well. And then you think about the other Fabric components, those will have to fit into Purview as well. So I think it remains to be seen a little bit how exactly that will take shape.
Okay. Um, anything else that you kind of see as a gap or a limitation?
Um, yeah, I think when it comes to this pooled resources model, right? We talked about the shift from platform as a service to software as a service. In this all in one platform, I'm pooling all of my compute across all of my resources, my data factory jobs, my data engineering jobs, my Power BI reports are all going to be pooling from the same compute units. So I worry about how can I isolate those workloads in a Fabric capacity. So, I think about maybe I've built a data engineering pipeline that needs to run in the morning, and then maybe there's a huge spike in activity for my users, and that might slow down or you know constrict the resources available to my data engineering pipeline. So how can I isolate those workloads? Or even worse, my data engineering pipeline is inefficient and I'm impacting the business user's ability to get to that data. So I really wanted to see a way to isolate the workloads in a Fabric capacity.
Okay. So if I can recap all of that, we're talking about gaps and limitations as they currently exist within Microsoft Fabric. One, you think that most of the stuff is likely going to be ironed out by the time it reaches GA, which is basically looking at, let's say, early 2024. Um, one major issue is that there's no way to orchestrate jobs from different workspaces, which is going to be a big issue if somebody is adopting a medallion architecture in particular. Another concern is around the overall security and governance model. As we all know, if you've worked with Microsoft, the security model is already confusing enough. This kind of muddies the water that much more. And then the final concern is workloads effectively using the same capacity resources and becoming overburdened in situations where there's big spikes in usage. So does that kind of accurately summarize just the gaps, the limitations, the concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm trying to be active in the communities and learn about other challenges that people are experiencing. So if anyone is watching and feels like they have a specific reservation about some
Yeah.
of the feature capability in Fabric, I would love to chat with you about it.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to move into the last couple of questions for the day. So let's just call it like it is. Outside of Data Activator, a lot of Microsoft Fabric just honestly seems like a repackaging or rebundling of stuff that already existed. Um, so, what do you think the motivation and rationale was behind all of it in the first place from Microsoft? Like, where do you think they were coming from in terms of making this a big shift in terms of the product direction?
Yeah, I think one of the trends that we've been seeing in the data analytics space is the adoption of a lot of different microservices that will make up an end-to-end data analytics platform. What Microsoft is doing is they're bringing that into a monolith platform,
Mhm.
right? An all-in-one. And Microsoft is really good at this. They're really good at packaging and bundling and incentivizing customers to use more of their products. I think about dozens of customers who have a Microsoft 365 enterprise license. They want to use Outlook, they want to use SharePoint, they want to use PowerPoint, Excel, and so on. That gives them a natural entry point to start experimenting with Power
Yeah.
BI. And as we discussed, since it is one of the most widely adopted and one of the best data and analytics visualization platforms out there, customers see that value when they start experimenting with it, and they come to us and they say, "This is amazing. How can I scale this?" And usually that conversation begins with, "Well, let's think about the licensing model that we want."
Yeah.
So we think about that transition from M365 Enterprise to Power BI. Now we're going to start thinking about that transition from, okay, I've already adopted Power BI. Now I have this Fabric experience or this Fabric capability at my hands. How can I start to adopt that as well? So anyone who has started to dip their toes into Power BI is now going to be naturally curious and start experimenting with Fabric.
Yeah, and I think for me, the first point that you brought up, I think that's the key one for me. I think that's the prime motivation behind it from Microsoft, that they're really trying to kill the modern modular data stack as we've known it for the past several years. So, why pay for multiple vendors, for multiple microservices to do ingestion or transformation or adopt a data platform or pay a license fee for a different BI platform when you can just do it all in one? Um, TBD on how it all takes shape from a functionality and performance perspective, but I really kind of view Fabric as, Microsoft's Death Star that they're firing at the modern data stack. So I definitely think it's their warning shot for sure in the marketplace. Um, so actually, we have a question in the chat. I think this actually kind of ties in nicely to what we were just talking about. Um, can you tell me how Fabric differs from something like using Fivetran, DBT, and Snowflake?
Yeah, that absolutely fits into that competition between microservices and a monolith platform. So if you think about the different components that are listed there, something like Fivetran, in the Fabric world, you might be using the data factory experience to do all of your ELT and connect to your data sources. If you have DBT to perform data transformations, that can be done in a variety of ways in Fabric. There is the data flow Gen 2. There's, you can use T-SQL transformations in the data warehouse experience. You can use Python or PySpark in the data engineering, like notebook type experience. And then with Snowflake, right? And rather than having Snowflake as your data platform, you're going to have one lake sitting behind it all, and then you can create other data warehouses or lake houses backed by that one lake. So all of those components or capabilities that are in an architecture with a Fivetran, DBT, Snowflake would all be self-contained within Fabric.
Okay. Okay. Um, so last question here, or well, second to last question. I'll give you a relatively easy one. What gets you excited about Microsoft Fabric?
Yeah, of course, since I, am such a proponent of Power BI and I've seen how that experience has evolved over time. One of the things I'm most excited about is the Direct Lake feature. So
Okay.
Direct Lake is a new way to connect to your data from a Power BI data model. So in the past, right, you might think about making a decision between, do I want to import and replicate my data for best performance? And then I have to think about how often I want to schedule refreshes for that. Or do I want to go direct query? Is it more important for me to have closer to live data at the sacrifice of some performance? So what Direct Lake does is it gives you the best of both worlds. Direct Lake is when you have your Fabric Lakehouse data and you are connecting directly to that. And because of the way that Lakehouse in Fabric stores data in Delta Parquet files, it's optimized that compression so that the backend, the Vertipack engine behind Power BI, can easily access that data without going through, context translations to other query languages. So it's going to yield import-like performance, but you're not going to have to worry about the replication, and you are going to get close to live data like you would with direct query.
Yeah, and I think that's such a cool feature because to me, whenever I'm talking Power BI with customers or prospects or existing clients, the thing that I always like to try to stress is that the choice that you make for development path forward in terms of data into Power BI is one of the most critical decisions that you can make in an implementation. So to have that additional option at your disposal, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Direct Lake is only on F64 SKUs, right?
I would have to double check the documentation on that, but I know that one of the prerequisites is that you need um, to use the One Lake as your backend for Direct Lake.
Okay. Regardless, we'll look into the licensing model, but I still think just kind of having that additional option at your disposal for development, that's really cool. For me personally, what gets me excited about Fabric is that kind of gives a potential avenue for customers that may have just been doing transformations all within Power BI. They might have a single SQL Server instance and they're pulling all of their data into Power BI, running all their transformations in Power Query. Potentially gives them an avenue to kind of build something a little bit more scalable within an ecosystem that they're familiar with. So I think for me, that's kind of the thing above all else that gets me excited about it. So last question for today. I know we're over time, and then we'll wrap things up. We'll open it up for audience Q&A. What advice do you have for customers that are considering Fabric today?
Yeah, I think I'd give the same advice that I would with the introduction of any new tool or platform or technology. It's not a silver bullet. You're not going to buy Fabric and then overnight have revolutionized your data and analytics stack. Um, there's other components to consider there. There's the people and the process behind it. You need to make sure that your developers and your end users alike both have proper training and enablement so they can utilize it effectively. You would want to establish a center of excellence around it so that, as new features come out, you're making sure that those are being adopted properly. And of course, we mentioned it earlier, but you want to make sure that adopting Fabric fits into your data governance model. You need to make sure that your data is secured, especially in the cases of sensitive data. And then you need to establish process too, right? There's hundreds of different ways now that you can architect a solution. You can use lake houses, you can use warehouses, you can use a variety of different things in Fabric. You need to consider which pieces of that are going to be best fit for your organization.
So what you're telling me is I can't just sign up for the 60-day free trial and expect everything to be magically solved.
Nope, it will require some work to get there, but it will enable a lot of new things, which are exciting.
But with that, we'll open it up for any Q&A. We'll take a quick peek at the chat and see if there's anything out there. Where would you recommend someone start in learning about Microsoft Fabric or just generally using it?
Yeah, a few different places. Like we said earlier, just try it. Use the 60-day free trial. There's a lot of really great tutorials on Microsoft directly on their documentation. There's some really great community forums. The Power BI community has already been there. There's now the Fabric community. There's user groups that you can engage with. Like Kevin mentioned earlier, the Fabric subreddit, there's a lot of engagement from some very prominent Microsoft employees like Adam Saxton, Christian Wade, and some others. You could check out some other content creators like Guy in a Cube or Razor Rad with Radicad. And obviously talk to us, talk to Kevin and myself.
Talk to us first. Another question. What are key differentiators you walk companies through when they're considering whether to use an end-to-end platform, such as what Microsoft Fabric wants to be, versus a modular microservices-based stack, such as the example with Fivetran, DBT, and Snowflake?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the intent of having a monolith platform is to simplify the licensing and cost-based conversations. It becomes much easier when it's all in a monolith if you think about scaling the architecture. It's much easier to scale up from an F32 to an F64 through a click versus, you start experiencing really high data volumes, and then you have to think about scaling 3 different microservices independently. So scale is a really important question when you talk about microservices. And in some cases, right, when you're bundling, just like with anything like insurance or anything else, right, there are cost benefits of having that all in one bundled cost. You can certainly see some cost benefits from that.
Yeah, and I think one of the points that I would bring too is you have to consider the other side of it, which is that you are on a platform monolith. You have to be comfortable with those architecture components that you're leveraging. So it's really kind of making that decision criteria in terms of what's important to you from just overall developer skill set that they're comfortable with internally within your org that they're using versus moving to something that's kind of all in one, and that's your lane. That's kind of the lane that you're operating on. So I think we can start wrapping things up. I know that we're pretty over time, but again, thank you for everybody who joined today, everybody who listened, all the good questions out there. Again, if you do have any questions around Microsoft Fabric, Microsoft services in general, feel free to reach out to myself, to David. Check out our Microsoft Fabric blog post that's going to be coming out when we wrap up here. And with that, I hope you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.